I'm Katherine Gibson for Insight. Today I'm joined by Ayad Akhtar, the author of the new novel, American Dervish. Ayad, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, my pleasure.
Can you tell me a little bit about the book and where the title American Dervish comes from?
Sure. The book is mostly about Hayat Shah. He's ages of 10 to 12. He's a Pakistani-American boy who's growing up in Wisconsin, and he lives in a secular Muslim household. His parents are not particularly interested in the faith, but his interest in Islam is sparked by the arrival of a beautiful and brilliant, charismatic Pakistani woman into his life, into his family's life, his mother's best friend, who's fleeing a divorce in Pakistan and comes to rebuild her life in America. Her name is Mina Ali, and she is a contradiction in so many ways. She is enlightened and Western-leaning and devout and very practiced and well-versed in the tradition. She teaches Hayat about the stories of the Prophet, and she teaches about the Quran, and this kind of begins a spiritual awakening in the boy that also dovetails with the time when his body is waking up to being a man.
One line stood out for me in particular in regards to women in Islam. It's when you wrote, "When a Muslim woman is too smart, she pays the price for it." Can you talk a little bit about how that idea informed your depiction of Mina?
It's always complicated to tease out the ways in which authorial intention is represented or not represented by what a character says in a book. But in that particular instance, the mother, who studied psychology and is constantly quoting Freud through the book, has this idea that Muslim men are afraid of women and that the intelligence of women is something that causes them grief. And Mina is certainly the most brilliant person in the book, and she in many ways has the most difficult life. Though the question of whether that life is chosen or whether that is imposed upon her is, of course, one of the biggest questions in the book.
You share the experience of growing up Pakistani-American in the Midwest with your young narrator. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how that contributed to the development of the book?
I grew up in Wisconsin, like Hayat, and my folks are both from Pakistan, like Hayat, and they are both secular, like Hayat's parents. I got very interested in religion. There was not really a Mina per se in my life, but Mina is a composite in many ways of so many of the influential women who have shaped my life. I think women figures have been the people who have really taught me the most. And so I, as a young boy, became very interested in Islam. I became very devout, and I think my folks were a little confused about what was going on, but they allowed it. And the book tracks metaphorically the same experience that I had, which is that I became very devout, became very interested in the faith, and then over the course of my high school years began to go through some kind of doubt. And then there was a shedding of that childhood faith, the death of that relationship to religion, and then a resurgence, as Hayat has at the end of the book, to some renewed sense of the spiritual, as it were.
Hayat's mother keeps saying throughout the book, "You'll be the exception, a Muslim man who respects women." Throughout the book, there's this sense that people are locked into their identities by culture.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about this idea and how it plays out in the novel?
I think that one of the responses in the immigrant American experience, which is of course an experience of rupture from tradition and then renewal of the self in some new way, is that rupture and renewal plays itself out in some people's cases by adherence to the tradition in ways that perhaps the folks back in the homeland might not even adhere to it. And so when you're at sea in a new world, sometimes you can latch on to your identity as a way to fix yourself and to understand who you are in ways that you might not need to if you were part of the majority culture. So that's one way of seeing how some of the social roles are locked in the book. But importantly, the question of women and Islam, which is one of the central questions of the book, to my mind is a complicated one in the sense that there's of course the history of patriarchal domination, which we see in the Judeo-Christian, we see in the Abrahamic faiths in general. But there's also the complicity. That is to say, there's a complicity of the mothers teaching their children, their sons, certain ways of behaving that perpetuate certain traditions.
One of the ways that you play around with culture in the book, and one of my favorite passages, is the comparison between Bollywood movies and Hollywood movies, and that contrast between the East and the West. Can you explain that a bit for us?
Yeah, I was referring more to the Indian weepy tradition. So, but yes, there's a passage in the book in which the narrator is talking about the fact that his parents loved these Indian weepies, which were about unconsummated love, or love that's consummated at great cost, that always end in death, a tragic register, a melancholy register, the register of the ghazal, the great tradition, the Persian and Urdu tradition of the love song, which always ends badly, but is exquisitely beautiful. And that sense of the piercing beauty and sadness of life is at the essence of a way of seeing that I think is very close to, at least the book proposes, is close to the Islamic or the more Eastern mythos. And the Western mythos might more accurately be represented by the happily ever after, the renewal of the self and the reconstitution of the world, which, of course, people from the other part of the world look at and say, well, that's just a story. That's not how life is.
Apart from Mina and Hayat, who have a kind of an open interpretation of Islam in the book, you have some pretty tough representations of the rest of the Muslim community around them. Yeah. Did you ever fear that you had gone too far in those representations?
My responsibility is not to a political agenda. I am not interested in the optics of my representation. That is to say, it's not important to me that I correct the perception that's out there. I, as an artist, have a twin aesthetic principle. First, that it must give pleasure, and second, that it must be guided by a pursuit of the truth. So if I am being true to my own observations, my own experiences, that's the best that I can do.
One of the major parts of the book is that difference in religion between intention and action. And I'm wondering how you would apply that to the relationship here in America to American Muslims and Christians and Jews and Muslims all around the world.
The book dramatizes the confrontation between 3 points of view on faith. The first is the rationalist, humanist rejection of faith. The second is the literalist, orthodox adherence to faith as a rule-bound identity marker. And the third is the personal mystical interpretation of faith as a vehicle to a deeper sense of life. So those 3 points of view are battling it out in the evolving consciousness of this preteen boy. And the notion of intention is something that Mina, who represents the personal mystical approach, conveys to Hayat as the most essential part of faith. What I wanted to do was to write a book that was true to the experience of faith in all of its complexity. The ways in which we use it to define ourselves, the ways in which we use it to experience rapture, the ways in which we use it to hurt each other, and fundamentally, the ways in which we experience doubt because of faith.
Well, thank you very much for coming here to speak about it. I enjoyed it very much.
Oh, thank you.